In a quiet little town, where the air smelled of freshly cut grass and the streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges, there lived a man named Derek. Derek wasn't someone who craved attention. He was just an ordinary guy, hardworking, kind, and always ready to lend a hand to his neighbors. Life was good for him. He had a loving family, a wife who kept their home warm, and 2 kids who filled the house with laughter. And then there was the house itself, set on a sprawling piece of land surrounded by tall trees that swayed gently in the breeze. It was his dream home, or so he thought. Derek had bought this property 5 years ago, after months of searching. When he first saw it, he knew it was perfect. The land felt like a sanctuary, far enough from the noise of the city but close enough to stay connected. He imagined barbecues in the backyard, lazy Sunday afternoons watching the kids play, and evenings sitting on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. Everything about it felt right. Or at least, it did, until one fateful morning when an envelope arrived in his mailbox. At first glance, it looked harmless enough, an official-looking letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA. Derek didn't think much of it. After all, he'd paid his dues on time, followed the rules, and never caused any trouble. But as he opened the envelope and began reading, his heart sank. The letter accused him of violating multiple HOA regulations. Worse still, it demanded a fine of $350,000. Derek blinked twice, thinking maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him. $350,000? That number seemed unreal, like something out of a bad dream. He read the letter again, slower this time, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. According to the HOA, Derek had made unauthorized changes to his property. They claimed his shed was too close to the boundary line, his driveway extension encroached on community land, and even parts of his backyard patio violated zoning laws. He stood there in his kitchen, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. His mind raced. None of this made sense. Sure, he'd added a few things over the years, a shed here, a small extension there, but everything had been approved when he purchased the land. He remembered signing papers, attending meetings, and going through inspections. How could they suddenly turn around and say he'd done something wrong? Frustrated and confused, Derek decided to reach out to the HOA board for clarification. Maybe there had been a mistake, he thought. People make errors all the time, right? So he called them up, expecting a simple explanation. Instead, he got silence. Literally. The person on the other end of the phone listened quietly as Derek explained his situation, then responded with a curt, "We'll look into it," before hanging up. That was the first red flag. Over the next few days, Derek tried reaching out again, only to face more stonewalling. No one wanted to give him straight answers. Finally, during one particularly heated conversation, a member of the board dropped a bombshell: "Look, your structures are encroaching on community land. You need to fix it or else." Encroaching? Community land? Derek's head spun. He had paid good money for this property. Every inch of it was supposed to be his. What exactly were they talking about? Determined to get to the bottom of things, Derek dug out the original documents he'd received when he bought the land. He pored over maps, deeds, and contracts, looking for anything that might explain the situation. But nothing jumped out at him. Everything appeared to be in order. It was then that a thought crept into his mind, a nagging suspicion that wouldn't go away. What if the problem wasn't with his property at all? What if the issue lay somewhere else entirely? Little did Derek know, this hunch would lead him down a rabbit hole of secrets, lies, and betrayal that would shake his entire neighborhood to its core. But for now, all he could do was sit in his living room, staring at the stack of papers spread across his coffee table. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. $350,000 was no small amount. It could ruin him financially. Yet, deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. And Derek wasn't the type to back down without a fight. Derek knew he couldn't tackle this mess alone. He wasn't a lawyer, and the HOA's vague accusations felt like they were designed to confuse him. So, he did what any reasonable person would do: he hired someone who could help. After asking around and doing some research, Derek found a lawyer who specialized in real estate disputes. The lawyer was no nonsense but had a calm demeanor that put Derek at ease. Their first meeting was straightforward. Derek laid out everything that had happened so far, from the shocking find to the cryptic responses from the HOA. The lawyer listened carefully, nodding occasionally as Derek spoke. When Derek finished, the lawyer leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the desk. "This doesn't add up," he said finally. "Something's off here. Let's dig deeper." What followed was weeks of painstaking investigation. Derek's lawyer started by pulling every document related to the property: the original deed, zoning permits, survey maps, and even old correspondence between Derek and the HOA when he first bought the land. It was tedious work, sifting through years' worth of paperwork, but Derek didn't mind. He wanted answers, and if it meant spending hours combing through dusty files, so be it. As they dug deeper, patterns began to emerge, patterns that made Derek's blood run cold. For starters, the HOA's own records were inconsistent. Some documents clearly showed Derek's property lines extending farther than the HOA claimed. Others, however, painted a different picture, suggesting that parts of his land actually belonged to the community. It was as if someone had deliberately tampered with the records to muddy the waters. But that wasn't the worst of it. One day, while reviewing blueprints of the neighborhood's layout, Derek's lawyer stumbled upon something shocking. Several homes in the development, including some owned by members of the HOA board, had been built partially on what should have been Derek's land. At first, Derek thought he must have misunderstood. How could entire houses be sitting on his property without anyone noticing? But the evidence was undeniable. The blueprints didn't lie. Derek sat in stunned silence as his lawyer explained the implications. "It looks like there was a mistake, or maybe something worse, when the land was divided up years ago," the lawyer said. "And instead of fixing it, the HOA has been sweeping it under the rug." Anger bubbled inside Derek, but it was mixed with disbelief. How could something like this happen? And why hadn't anyone caught it before? He decided to confront the HOA directly, armed with the new information. Surely, once they saw the proof, they'd admit their error and drop the ridiculous fine. He requested another meeting with the board, this time bringing his lawyer along for support. The atmosphere was tense from the start. The board members sat stiffly around the table, their faces unreadable. Derek laid out the findings, the conflicting documents, the blueprints, everything. He expected them to be shocked or at least apologetic. Instead, they barely reacted. One of the board members, an older man with thinning hair and a sharp suit, cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson," he said slowly, "you're making a lot of accusations here. Do you have any idea how damaging these claims could be?" Derek blinked. Was this guy serious? They were accusing him of causing trouble? With all due respect, Derek shot back, "I'm not the one who built houses on the wrong land. You need to explain this." The room fell silent. No one answered. The same board member who had spoken earlier glanced nervously at his colleagues before saying, "We'll review your concerns. But until then, the fine stands." Derek left the meeting feeling more frustrated than ever. The HOA wasn't just denying responsibility, they were doubling down. It was clear they weren't going to admit anything unless forced to. But Derek refused to give up. If they wouldn't come clean willingly, he'd have to find a way to make them. Back at home, Derek pored over the documents again, searching for anything he might have missed. His wife, sensing his frustration, tried to reassure him. "You're doing the right thing," she told him one evening as they sat together in the living room. "Even if it feels impossible now, the truth will come out eventually." Her words gave him strength, but the stress was taking its toll. Sleepless nights became the norm, and the constant worry weighed heavily on him. Still, Derek kept pushing forward. He started reaching out to former residents of the neighborhood, hoping someone might have insight into how the land had been divided. Most people either didn't know or didn't want to get involved, but a few shared stories that hinted at similar issues in the past. One retired couple, who had lived in the area for decades, mentioned hearing rumors about boundary disputes when the subdivision was first developed. No one ever proved anything, the husband said with a shrug. But it wouldn't surprise me if corners were cut back then. Each piece of information brought Derek closer to understanding the full scope of the problem. But it also painted a troubling picture. The HOA wasn't just incompetent, it was complicit. Someone, somewhere, had allowed this mess to happen. And now, Derek was paying the price. As the days turned into weeks, Derek realized that exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. The HOA had power, connections, and resources. Taking them on would require patience, persistence, and a willingness to face whatever came next. But Derek had reached a point where backing down wasn't an option. This wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about justice. And deep down, he knew he wasn't fighting alone. As Derek continued to dig into the tangled web of documents, maps, and blueprints, word about his battle with the HOA began to spread through the neighborhood. It started small whispers at the local coffee shop, hushed conversations during school drop-offs, and a few curious glances whenever Derek walked by. But soon, the story took on a life of its own. One morning, Derek noticed a flyer taped to a lamppost near his driveway. The headline read, "Is our neighbor trying to destroy our community?" His stomach dropped as he read the rest of it. Someone, likely someone connected to the HOA, had plastered flyers all over the neighborhood, accusing him of greed and selfishness. They claimed he was stirring up trouble for personal gain, threatening the stability of the community. There was even a vague suggestion that his actions could lower everyone's property values. Derek crumpled the flyer in his fist, anger bubbling inside him. He wasn't doing this for money or revenge, he just wanted answers. But it seemed like the HOA had decided to fight dirty, turning the entire neighborhood against him. That night, as he sat at the kitchen table with his wife, going over the latest batch of anonymous letters that had been slipped under their door, he felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him. "They're trying to make you look like the bad guy," his wife said, her voice tight with frustration. "But we both know the truth." She was right, but knowing the truth didn't stop the hostility from creeping into their daily lives. A few days later, Derek found his car tires slashed. Then came the late-night phone calls, muffled voices on the other end warning him to drop it before things got worse. For a while, Derek considered installing security cameras around the house, but he worried it might escalate the situation further. Instead, he focused on staying calm and sticking to the facts. He knew that losing his temper would only play into the HOA's hands. Despite the growing tension, not everyone turned against Derek. Some neighbors quietly reached out to offer support. One elderly woman who lived 2 streets over stopped him one afternoon while he was walking his dog. "I've lived here for 30 years, she said, her voice low but firm. "And I've seen how they operate. Don't let them bully you." Her words gave Derek a glimmer of hope. Maybe he wasn't completely alone in this fight after all. Encouraged, he started reaching out to other residents, asking if anyone else had experienced similar issues with the HOA. To his surprise, a handful of people admitted they'd had run-ins with the board over petty fines or unreasonable demands. Most hadn't pushed back because they didn't want to deal with the hassle or the backlash, but hearing Derek's story made them reconsider. Slowly, a small group of allies began to form. They weren't activists or troublemakers, they were ordinary people who simply wanted fairness. Together, they started sharing information, pooling resources, and strategizing ways to hold the HOA accountable. One neighbor, a retired teacher, offered to organize a petition demanding greater transparency from the board. Another, a tech-savvy college student home for the summer, set up a private online forum where residents could discuss their concerns without fear of retaliation. Meanwhile, cracks began to appear within the HOA itself. Behind closed doors, longtime members whispered about the mounting pressure. Some admitted they'd always suspected something wasn't quite right with the property lines but had stayed silent out of fear of rocking the boat. Others were furious that the board had mishandled the situation so badly, allowing Derek's case to spiral out of control. A particularly telling moment came when one board member, a middle-aged woman who rarely spoke up during meetings, publicly questioned the legality of the $350,000 fine. "We don't have the evidence to back this up," she said during a heated session. "If we push this too far, we'll end up in court, and that's not good for anyone." Her comments sparked a flurry of debate among the board members, many of whom seemed torn between defending their stance and avoiding further scrutiny. It was clear that the HOA was starting to fracture under the strain. And Derek, watching from the sidelines, realized that the tide might finally be turning in his favor. But the real breakthrough came when a reporter from the local newspaper caught wind of the story. At first, Derek was hesitant to talk to the media. He didn't want to come across as attention-seeking or risk alienating more neighbors. But his lawyer convinced him that shining a light on the issue could force the HOA to act. "Sometimes, public pressure is the only thing that gets results," the lawyer explained. Reluctantly, Derek agreed to an interview. Sitting across from the reporter in his living room, he laid out the facts as plainly as possible. He talked about the initial fine, the conflicting documents, and the discovery that parts of his land had been used without permission. He also shared the emotional toll the ordeal had taken on his family, the sleepless nights, the threats, the feeling of being ostracized in their own community. The article ran a few days later, and the response was overwhelming. Residents who had previously kept quiet suddenly came forward with their own stories of unfair treatment by the HOA. Others expressed shock and outrage at the idea that homes in the neighborhood might have been built on the wrong land. The story quickly gained traction, spreading beyond the local paper to larger outlets. Before long, reporters from TV stations and online news platforms were knocking on Derek's door, eager to hear more. With each new wave of coverage, the pressure on the HOA grew. Board members scrambled to contain the damage, issuing vague statements about misunderstandings and promising to address the concerns raised by residents. But their efforts only fueled more skepticism. People wanted answers, and they wanted them now. For Derek, the attention brought both relief and anxiety. On one hand, it felt good to know that others were finally seeing the truth. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the fear that the HOA might retaliate even harder. Still, he refused to back down. With his lawyer's guidance, he filed a formal complaint against the association, alleging harassment, fraud, and mismanagement. The legal process would take time, but Derek knew it was a necessary step toward holding the HOA accountable. As the weeks went by, the neighborhood transformed into a battleground of opinions. Some residents rallied behind Derek, attending town hall meetings to demand reform. Others clung to the HOA, fearful of change. Tensions simmered just below the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. But through it all, Derek remained steadfast. He wasn't fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for everyone who had ever felt powerless against the system. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: the truth was coming out, whether the HOA liked it or not. As the scandal surrounding Derek's case continued to grow, the pressure on the HOA became unbearable. The media coverage had turned what was once a private dispute into a public spectacle, and residents were demanding answers. Local news outlets couldn't get enough of the story. Homeowners Association accused of land grab. Did your HOA steal your property? Screamed the headlines. Reporters camped out near Derek's house, hoping to catch a glimpse of him or snag another exclusive interview. Neighbors who had previously stayed silent were now speaking up, sharing their own grievances with the HOA. The board members, once confident in their authority, looked increasingly cornered. They held emergency meetings behind closed doors, trying desperately to figure out how to contain the fallout. But every attempt to smooth things over only made things worse. When they issued a vague statement saying, "We are committed to resolving these concerns responsibly," it was met with ridicule. People wanted specifics, not empty promises. Finally, after weeks of mounting tension, the HOA agreed to do something they had resisted for months: commission an independent survey of the entire neighborhood. This wasn't just about Derek's property anymore, it was about determining whether other homes in the development had been built on land that didn't belong to them. The decision came reluctantly, under intense public scrutiny and legal pressure, but it marked a turning point in the saga. Derek watched as surveyors arrived, armed with equipment and maps, ready to redraw the boundaries of the community. For days, they worked tirelessly, measuring distances, marking points, and cross-referencing old documents. Residents gathered in small clusters, watching curiously as stakes were driven into the ground and ribbons fluttered in the breeze. Some people joked nervously about whose backyard might disappear next. Others stood silently, their arms crossed, waiting anxiously for the results. When the survey was complete, the findings confirmed everything Derek had suspected and more. Not only had parts of his property been wrongfully claimed by the HOA, but several homes in the neighborhood, including some belonging to prominent board members, had been built partially on Derek's land without permission. In one particularly egregious case, an entire section of someone's garden was technically sitting on Derek's side of the boundary line. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. People were outraged not just at the HOA, but at themselves for not questioning the status quo sooner. How could this have happened? Who had allowed it to go unchecked for so long? The answers weren't pretty. It turned out that during the original subdivision process years earlier, mistakes or possibly deliberate actions had led to incorrect boundary lines being recorded. Rather than addressing the issue, the HOA had chosen to ignore it, letting the problem fester until it exploded in their faces. Public outrage reached a fever pitch. Residents demanded resignations from the HOA board, accusing its members of incompetence, corruption, and outright greed. Several high-profile members stepped down amid the chaos, citing personal reasons. One former board member even admitted privately to reporters that they had always known there were discrepancies in the property lines but feared the consequences of speaking up. "It's not like anyone wanted to rock the boat," he said. "But looking back, I realize we should have done something." Local authorities launched an investigation into whether criminal fraud had occurred during the initial sale of lots in the subdivision. Investigators combed through decades-old records, interviewing past developers, real estate agents, and government officials involved in the project. While the probe would take time to yield results, the mere fact that it was happening sent a clear message: no one was above accountability. For Derek, the vindication was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt a sense of relief knowing that the truth had finally come out. On the other hand, the damage done to his family and his community couldn't be undone overnight. The stress of the past months had taken its toll not just on him, but on his wife and kids too. His youngest child had started having trouble sleeping, waking up in tears after nightmares about strangers yelling at their house. Even his dog seemed skittish, barking at shadows and unfamiliar sounds. Still, Derek refused to let bitterness consume him. He focused instead on using the momentum of the moment to push for meaningful change. With the support of his growing group of allies, he organized town hall meetings where residents could voice their frustrations and propose solutions. Topics ranged from reforming the HOA's leadership structure to implementing stricter oversight measures. Ideas flowed freely, and for the first time in years, people felt empowered to shape the future of their community. One particularly memorable meeting saw a record turnout. Dozens of residents packed into the local community center, spilling into the hallway because there weren't enough chairs. Emotions ran high as people shared their stories, some angry, others tearful, but all united in their desire for justice. Derek stood at the front of the room, listening intently as speaker after speaker recounted their experiences with the HOA. When it was his turn to talk, he kept his remarks brief but heartfelt. "This isn't just my fight anymore," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "It's our fight. Together, we can make sure this never happens again." His words were met with applause, cheers, and even a few standing ovations. For many in the room, it was the first time they'd felt truly heard. And while the road ahead promised to be challenging, there was a renewed sense of hope in the air. Behind the scenes, Derek's lawyer worked tirelessly to ensure that the HOA faced consequences for their actions. Armed with the survey results and mounting evidence of misconduct, they filed a lawsuit seeking not only restitution for Derek but also systemic reforms within the association. The legal battle would drag on for months, but early indications suggested that Derek had a strong case. In the meantime, life in the neighborhood began to shift. Longtime residents who had kept to themselves started reaching out to neighbors, forming friendships and alliances. Newcomers, inspired by Derek's courage, joined the movement for change. Slowly but surely, the community began to heal. Yet, Derek knew the fight wasn't over. Winning the lawsuit would be a victory, but it wouldn't erase the scars left by the HOA's mismanagement. What mattered most to him now was ensuring that no one else had to endure what he and his family had gone through. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a quiet determination settle over him. The truth had come out, and with it, the possibility of a brighter future for everyone. Months had passed since the scandal broke, and the neighborhood was finally starting to see some semblance of closure. The legal battle between Derek and the HOA had been long and grueling, filled with tense courtroom sessions, endless paperwork, and moments when it felt like the odds were stacked against him. But Derek never wavered. He knew that this wasn't just about his property or the $350,000 fine anymore. It was about setting things right for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of a corrupt system. The court case reached its climax on a chilly autumn morning. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors, reporters, even curious onlookers from nearby towns had gathered to witness the outcome. Derek sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by his lawyer, trying to steady his nerves. His wife held his hand tightly, her eyes shining with both pride and apprehension. As the judge began delivering the verdict, the room fell silent, so quiet you could hear the faint rustle of papers being shuffled. When the words came in favor of the plaintiff, a wave of relief washed over Derek. It wasn't just a win, it was validation. The court ruled that the HOA had acted maliciously and negligently, fining Derek based on false claims while ignoring their own violations. Not only did they have to drop the ridiculous $350,000 penalty, but they were also ordered to pay Derek $750,000 in restitution. This included compensation for the years of harassment he and his family endured, as well as punitive damages meant to hold the HOA accountable for their actions. But the ruling didn't stop there. The judge mandated sweeping changes within the HOA, including the removal of all current board members and the establishment of a new leadership team elected by residents. Transparency measures were put in place, requiring regular audits and open meetings where homeowners could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. For the first time in years, the power dynamic shifted back toward the people, the actual homeowners who had always been the ones footing the bills and living under the rules. As Derek walked out of the courthouse that day, surrounded by cheers and applause from his supporters, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. There was joy, of course, but also exhaustion. The fight had taken a toll on him physically and emotionally. Yet, looking around at the faces of his neighbors, some smiling, others tearful, he realized that the victory belonged to all of them. They had stood together, refusing to let fear silence them, and in doing so, they had sparked a movement. Back home, life slowly began returning to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could get after such an ordeal. The slashed tires and threatening phone calls stopped. Anonymous flyers criticizing Derek disappeared from lampposts. Even the tension in the air seemed to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid eye contact now waved hello or stopped to chat. Some even apologized for doubting Derek early on, admitting they'd been misled by the HOA smear campaign. Derek didn't hold grudges. Instead, he welcomed the renewed sense of community spirit. He hosted barbecues in his backyard again, inviting anyone who wanted to come. These gatherings became more than just social events, they turned into forums where residents discussed ideas for improving the neighborhood. From planting trees along the main road to organizing monthly clean-up days, people were eager to take ownership of their community in ways they hadn't before. One evening, during one of these barbecues, an older woman approached Derek with tears in her eyes. She had lived in the neighborhood for decades and confessed she had always suspected something was off with the HOA but had never dared to speak up. "You gave us hope," she said, her voice trembling. "And not just here, you've inspired people everywhere to stand up for what's right." Her words stayed with Derek long after the party ended. He realized that his story wasn't just a local issue anymore. Thanks to the media coverage, it had resonated far beyond the borders of his small town. People across the country were sharing their own experiences with HOAs, some reaching out to Derek for advice on how to challenge unfair practices. Advocacy groups fighting for homeowner rights invited him to speak at conferences and rallies, asking him to share his journey and inspire others to demand accountability. At first, Derek hesitated. He didn't consider himself a public figure or a crusader. He was just a regular guy who had stumbled into a mess and refused to back down. But as he saw the impact his story was having, he decided to embrace the role. If his experience could help others avoid the pain and frustration he had gone through, then it was worth stepping out of his comfort zone. With the support of advocacy organizations, Derek pushed for statewide reforms aimed at holding HOAs accountable. He worked alongside lawmakers to draft legislation requiring stricter oversight of homeowners associations, clearer guidelines for resolving disputes, and protections for residents facing retaliation. It wasn't easy. There were plenty of debates, compromises, and late-night strategy sessions, but Derek persisted, driven by the belief that change was possible. Years later, as Derek sat on his porch watching his kids play in the yard, he reflected on how much had changed since that fateful day he opened the envelope from the HOA. The scars were still there, the sleepless nights, the stress, the fractured relationships, but so was the resilience. His family had grown stronger through the ordeal, learning to lean on each other during the darkest times. And his community? It had transformed from a place divided by fear and mistrust into a neighborhood united by shared purpose. Every once in a while, someone would ask Derek why he kept pushing forward when the odds seemed insurmountable. "Because sometimes," he'd reply with a smile, "you don't know what you're fighting for until you realize what's already yours." It was a simple truth, but one that carried immense weight. Derek had fought not just for his land, but for justice, transparency, and the idea that ordinary people could stand up to those in power and win. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, he faced them with the same determination that had carried him through the toughest days of his life. After all, he had proven one thing beyond a shadow of a doubt: when you refuse to give up, anything is possible.